Mitigation is an inelegant word used to describe even more jargon, resolving adverse effects to historic properties. In cultural resource management, mitigation usually means research, photography, measuring, and archaeological investigations. Oftentimes, mitigation products end up in three-ring binders, databases, and curation boxes far from communities. Mitigation plans depend on the accuracy of the earlier research that determined a particular property or space historic. The premise is that mitigation is commensurate with the type of historic property, its historical significance, and the action that will alter or destroy it. Many equate mitigation with preservation, yet in reality, it is only compensation for a loss. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad built the Talbot Avenue Bridge in 1918. The bridge carried traffic over railroad tracks in Silver Spring, Maryland until early 2017. Already slated for demolition because it wouldn't accommodate a new light rail line, the local Department of Transportation deferred maintenance and allowed the bridge to deteriorate until it became unsafe to use. Montgomery County officials by the 1990s had established a record of not maintaining the bridge. The final closure in 2017 was one in a series that had included racially charged incidents and acrimony, pitting historically black Littonsville against historically white North Woodside. The bridge was stigmatized and pathologized. State transportation officials evaluated the bridge's historical significance to comply with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. The proposed light rail is federally funded, and Section 106 requires agencies to identify historic properties, evaluate their eligibility for listing in the National Register of Historic Places, and determine if the proposed project will adversely affect them. The Talbot Avenue Bridge was determined eligible for listing in the National Register as an engineering structure associated with the railroad. CRM professionals relied exclusively on earlier research by an archaeologist who did not examine the neighborhoods that the bridge connected. There was no ethnographic fieldwork and no documentary research done to understand how the bridge functioned beyond the rails below. The mitigation plan developed for the bridge fit its known historical significance. Without consulting people in the two neighborhoods on opposite sides of the tracks, transportation officials determined that the bridge would be documented according to historic American engineering record standards. That meant more research on its engineering and its association with the railroad. The mitigation plan was fully detached from historical and ethnographic reality. The neighborhood west of the bridge was an African-American hamlet that traces its roots to 1853, when Samuel Lytton, a free man of color, was able to buy 4 acres in Montgomery County, a jurisdiction with one of the highest enslavement rates in Maryland when the Civil War broke out. By the 1890s, Lyttonsville had become a cohesive black community with homes, a school, black-owned stores, and a church. North Woodside developed on the east side of the bridge. It is a residential subdivision located in a sundown suburb, a place with racial restrictive deed covenants and Jim Crow rules, with no African-American residents except domestic servants. Many stores, movie theaters, and restaurants there didn't accept black money. As late as 1967, Silver Spring was touted as a Washington suburb known for its segregation. History and historic preservation in Montgomery County are produced unevenly. It is a part of a diversity gap in historic preservation that erases, marginalizes, and tokenizes communities of color, their histories, and historic places and spaces. It's no surprise that the Section 106 work overlooked Littonsville. Local histories and historic preservation had erased it and rendered it invisible for decades. To find Littonsville's history, you need to talk to its remaining African-American residents and people displaced from the community by urban renewal and the slow creep of gentrification. Local histories and historic preservation documents don't use the words African-American and black, and they ignore anti-black racism in Silver Spring. For these sources, blacks and Jim Crow didn't exist in historic Silver Spring. In 2016, I began asking people where I could find black history sites in downtown Silver Spring. The consistent answer from county officials, residents, and people working there was that there aren't any. Some said Littonsville. Others mentioned Underground Railroad sites in rural parts of the county. Many suggested asking the Silver Spring Historical Society, the very group that has erased black history there. I started interviewing Littonsville residents. After decades of expulsive zoning, environmental racism, and urban renewal, they could only describe one surviving historic thing in their community, the Talbot Avenue Bridge.
The only thing that I could see in terms of historic is that bridge. The oldest thing there is that bridge.
The bridge was Littonsville's lifeline.
That was the bridge we used. It was only a few ways to get to the the wider community, to get to the stores, to get to transportation, was by the bridge. In those days, it was a necessity to go in and out of the community.
In September 2016, a Washington Post reporter read my first blog post about the bridge. Her article brought the bridge's history and its role in Jim Crow Silver Spring to a wider audience.
I had no idea it had any historical significance until I read your blog post about it.
The Talbot Avenue Bridge has probably taken on a life of its own.
Like Silver Spring's larger history, the bridge was erased and treated unevenly in historic preservation. Farther up the tracks, another bridge connecting two historically white communities had been locally designated and protected as historic. The affectionately named Humpback Bridge also was lovingly maintained and rehabilitated under historic preservation guidelines. As its demolition date neared, the bridge got wider exposure. In the summer of 2017, a local filmmaker produced a documentary about the bridge. That fall, I was invited to speak about the bridge and Littonsville's history at a community meeting held on the bridge. And in April of 2018, I curated the first Talbot Avenue Bridge pop-up museum, which drew about 100 people. With demolitions slated for 2019, Littonsville residents teamed up with their former adversaries across the tracks to plan and hold a centennial celebration. The September 22, 2018 event drew over 200 people and converted the abandoned infrastructure into a festival space featuring music, the pop-up museum, a libation ceremony, and storytellers. The event was a vernacular truth and reconciliation moment.
Racially restrictive deed covenants were common in Silver Spring. So I'm going to read an excerpt from one from my neighborhood. It is evidence that at one time, people in my neighborhood were interested in keeping it white.
The Centennial Celebration was a space where nearby neighbors and people from around the Washington region converged and achieved a greater understanding about the bridge's history. They also learned about people and communities rendered invisible by racialized history and historic preservation. Neighborhood planners intend to use the event to launch future community-building actions. Mitigation can be so much more than salvaging data. It can be a tool for educating, as recent creative approaches show with videos and other products. But it can also be ethnographically informed and community-based. The Talbot Avenue Bridge Centennial Celebration is an example of how one community wrested mitigation from above and created something better, something more meaningful than a hair report or an inventory form.